11 days after my father died, I was sitting in the same church where he'd been buried, listening to my mother tell 60 relatives that I had abandoned him. I could have stopped her. I could have told them exactly how many times I'd been at my father's house during his final year, but I didn't. Because 9 days after his death, I'd found a handwritten note hidden inside his hymnal. It said, "Marin, don't defend yourself at the service no matter what gets said. Let them talk. You'll understand why after." I read that sentence 6 times. I still didn't understand it. Why would a dying man knowingly let his daughter be accused of abandoning him? What did he know was going to happen? And why was he so certain that defending myself would be the wrong thing to do? I kept my promise. My mother finished her speech. My brother stood beside her. 60 people looked at me like I had failed my father. Then, 2 days later, we went to his lawyer's office to hear the will. The lawyer didn't start with the will. He started with a video. My name is Moran Voss and I am 34 years old. 11 days ago at my father's funeral, my mother stood up in the fellowship hall of First Lutheran Church in front of 60 relatives, holding paper plates of ham and scalloped potatoes, and told everyone I had abandoned him in his final year. My younger brother Dean stood next to her and let her say it. Nobody in that room knew that my father had made me promise 3 weeks before he died not to defend myself until after the funeral. I kept that promise. I stood there and took it. But here's what my mother didn't know. My father had already told the whole truth himself, on camera, and left instructions for exactly when it would be shown. If you're the kind of person who's ever sat quietly through an accusation you knew wasn't true, because someone you loved asked you to wait, I think you're going to want to stay for this one. Hit subscribe if stories about quiet people finally getting their moment means something to you, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, but only if this one actually earns it. Let me take you back to where this started, because you need to understand who my father was. Before you can understand what he did, I grew up in Cedar Falls, a town of about 9,400 people where the tallest building was the grain elevator and everybody's Sunday revolved around First Lutheran, where my mother has directed the choir for 22 years. My father, Walter Voss, worked 41 years at Kessler Baring, same shift, same steel-toed boots, until his knees gave out and they let him go with a plaque and a watch that stopped running within a year. He was a quiet man who fixed things instead of talking about them. When I was 9, my bike chain snapped on the same afternoon. Dean, who was 6, got a birthday party with a rented bounce house because he'd learned to ride without training wheels. My father spent that evening in the garage rebuilding my chain by hand instead of going to the party, and he never once mentioned it to me as some kind of sacrifice. He just fixed the bike. That was who he was. My mother was different. My mother believed appearances were a kind of moral fact. You looked devoted, you were devoted. If you called on Sundays and posted a nice photo, you were, quote, the good child. My mother's favorite sentence, one she used on me at least 4 times a year, growing up, was "real children show up." She said it about a neighbor boy who mowed his grandmother's lawn every week. She said it about a cousin who drove 3 hours for a reason. I didn't know yet that she would eventually say it about me at my father's funeral to 60 people, when I was the only one who had actually shown up. I became a nurse because of my father's garage, honestly, because I liked understanding how a thing worked and fixing exactly the part that was broken instead of guessing. I've worked the oncology and hospice float unit at Cedar Regional for 9 years now. I chart in 15-minute increments. I notice when a number is off by a little. That habit is the whole reason I'm able to tell you this story with dates attached. The rupture with my mother didn't happen all at once, quote. It built. There was a smaller version of it, years before the diagnosis, one I didn't understand the weight of until much later. When I was 26, I picked up an extra shift instead of driving up for my mother's church anniversary luncheon, because a coworker's kid was in the hospital and somebody had to cover. My mother didn't speak to me for 11 days. Dean, that same year, missed her birthday entirely because of a work trip to Denver, and she told everyone at the luncheon table that he was building something for the family, and that she'd never been prouder. I remember doing the math in my head even then. 11 days of silence for me, 0 for him, and telling myself it didn't mean anything. It meant everything. It just took a dying man's video to make me admit it. If I had to name the sentence that drew the real line, though, it was the one she said to me, the Week after my father's diagnosis, standing in her kitchen with a casserole dish in her hands for a neighbor whose husband had a hip replacement. Well, you're the nurse. This is really more your department than mine. That was March. That was the last time either of them offered to help. Here's where I want to pause and introduce you to the person who actually held me up through the next 11 months, because it matters that you meet him before the hard part, not just after. My husband Sam is a high school shop teacher, and he's not related to my father by blood at all, and he showed up more than anyone who was. The first week after the diagnosis, without me asking, Sam started setting his alarm for 5110 in the morning so he could drive me to my father's house before my 7 a.m. shift, sit with my dad while I checked his vitals and his med box, and then get me to the hospital with 4 minutes to spare. He did that, in some form, for 11 months. He learned to make my father's one request meal: canned tomato soup with a grilled cheese cut on the diagonal, never the square way, because it was the only thing that stayed down some weeks. Nobody in my family ever thanked him for any of it. I did. Every single day. Now, to understand what happened in that last year, you have to understand that I didn't just visit my father. I documented him. The way I'd been trained to document any patient whose condition could turn on a Tuesday. I kept a spiral notebook, the plain green kind you'd buy for a kid's homework, and I logged every visit by date and time, every medication and its count, every symptom that seemed new. I didn't start that notebook because I suspected anything. Quote, I started it because that's how you keep a dying man safe. It became something else later. But that came later. Stay with me, because the next part covers almost a full year, and I promise you it earns every minute. If you've ever kept score in your head while everyone else got credit for less, comment the number. I want to know I'm not the only one who counted. My father was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday in March at 10,014 in the morning, a detail I know because I was standing in the exam room in my scrubs on a break I wasn't supposed to be taking. The oncologist gave him, realistically, somewhere between 8 months and a year and a half. He got 11 months. Item 1 in the green notebook, March 19th, first chemo infusion, 4 hours, nausea starting at hour 3. I was there. My mother had choir rehearsal. Dean sent a text that said, rooting for you, Dad, with 2 exclamation points and an emoji, which he would later describe at Thanksgiving as checking in constantly. By April, my father was too tired most days to get up before 10. I started coming every morning, before my shift and most evenings after it, a habit that would eventually add up to 214 visits, a number I only know because I counted them afterward. The way you'd audit a chart. My mother visited on Sundays after church, usually for around 40 minutes, and always brought a casserole dish that Dad, who could barely keep down broth some days, would thank her for out of pure old-fashioned manners. She would post a photo of the visit, with a caption like Sunday with my sweetheart, and get 30-40 comments telling her what a devoted wife she was. I never once saw her check his med box. I don't say that to be cruel about a casserole dish. I say it because it's exactly the kind of detail that would have meant nothing on its own, and only started to mean something once I had 200 more just like it sitting next to it in the same notebook. That's the thing nobody tells you about being the one who documents. A single missed visit is nothing. A pattern of 100 of them is a diagnosis. By late April, my father's oncologist wanted to try a more aggressive chemo protocol, one with a rougher side effect profile, and the decision landed on me because I was the one who understood the terms on the consent form and the one physically in the room to sign it. I called my mother before I signed anything, out of respect, not obligation, and she told me she trusted my judgment completely, which sounded generous until I realized what she meant was that she didn't want the responsibility of the decision, only the credit for having been consulted. Item 40-something. I stopped being precise about the number around item 40 because May was the month everything sped up. My father's oncologist added a new medication, and I spent an evening on the phone with the pharmacy sorting out a coverage denial while my mother texted me a photo of a sunset from a church retreat with the caption, praying for your dad every hour. I didn't respond to that text for 2 days. When I finally did, she said I'd gotten cold. June brought a short window where the second-line treatment seemed to be working, and my father had enough energy for about 10 good days that felt, at the time, like the whole family exhaling at once. My mother visited 3 times that stretch instead of her usual one and told everyone at church that things were turning around, in a tone that made it sound like a group achievement rather than a temporary reprieve. I didn't correct her. I let my father have his 10 good days without an audit attached to them. Some things don't belong in the notebook even when you're the one keeping it. Dean visited twice between March and September, twice in 6 months, and he lived 78 miles away in Millbrook, which is a drive Sam and I made backward at the end of some double shifts just so I could still get 4 hours with my father before falling asleep on his couch. Dean's first visit was Father's Day, and he stayed 50 minutes and left before dinner because he had, in his words, a thing. His second visit was in August, and I know it was August 14th, because I wrote it in the notebook as item 91, and because it was the day my father, for the first time since diagnosis, asked me directly whether Dean was avoiding him. I told him no. Have never been sure that was the right thing to say. In between those two visits, sometime in July, I overheard my mother on the phone with a woman from choir describing how torn up Dean was about not being able to be there more, how his job made it impossible, how she worried about the toll it was taking on him. I was standing 4 feet away, having just come from giving my father a sponge bath because he could no longer manage the shower alone. She didn't lower her voice when I walked past. I don't think it occurred to her that there was anything to lower it for. Let me pause again because I know this part of the story is long and it's supposed to be 11 months doesn't compress into 5 minutes any more than a hospital shift does. If you're still with me, drop a "still here" in the comments because it helps me know which parts of a story actually land and which ones I should trim next time. I want to give you a moment on the other side of the ledger because it's important you understand this wasn't only grief. There was tenderness in it too, and Sam is where most of that lived. On my father's birthday in July, when he couldn't manage a big meal, Sam spent 2 nights in the garage, my father's garage, the same one from the bike story, building him a lap desk with a cup holder cut into it so he could eat soup in his recliner without spilling on himself, because losing that last shred of independence had been eating at him more than the cancer some days. My father used that lap desk every single day until the week he died. Nobody in my family ever asked where it came from. By September, my father needed help getting to the bathroom at night, and that's when I did the thing that would matter more than anything else in this story. I installed a small camera in the corner of his living room, the kind meant for keeping an eye on an elderly parent who lives alone, because he was falling sometimes and I needed to know if he went down when nobody was there. It cost $58. I told him exactly what it was and where it pointed, and he told me in his usual 4 words, "Fine. Good idea, kid." I checked that feed from my phone at work more nights than I can count, and more than once it told me to call an ambulance before he even had the chance to call me. I want to break here for just a second because I know some of you have lived a version of this, being the one who quietly rebuilds the chain while somebody else gets the bounce house. And if that's you, I need you to comment and tell me what year it happened because I read every single one of these. There's a version of me back then who might have called my mother that week in July and confronted her about the phone call I overheard, demanded she take it back or explain herself. I didn't, partly because I was too tired to have the argument on top of everything else, and partly because some instinct I couldn't name yet told me that the argument wouldn't change anything, that she believed her own version of events too completely for a single conversation to dent it. I've thought since then that this might be the real difference between people who eventually get their reckoning and people who never do. Not that they're angrier or more patient than everyone else, but that they know, somewhere underneath the anger, that some doors only open from the other side on someone else's timeline, and that pushing on them just wastes strength you'll need later. By October, my father had lost 41 pounds, another number I know exactly because I weighed him myself every Sunday morning on the same bathroom scale, at the same time, in the same robe, because consistency is the only way a number like that means anything. My mother, meanwhile, had started telling people at church that Dean called every single day, which I know was not true, because I sat with my father most evenings while he checked his phone, and Dean's calls averaged, by my count from the notebook, once every 9 or 10 days, usually lasting under 6 minutes. November brought Thanksgiving, and I remember it specifically because it was the last one. My mother hosted at her house, a house my father was too weak to sit up in for more than an hour, and she served the meal on the good china while telling everyone at the table, unprompted, how hard This whole ordeal had been on Dean, who had, she said, just been a rock. Dean nodded and looked appropriately somber. I had spent the previous night at my father's house monitoring a fever that spiked to 101.6 at 2 a.m., which meant I'd had 90 minutes of sleep before that. Dinner. Nobody at that table asked where I'd been the night before. Nobody asked because nobody thought to wonder. By December, my father needed help every 4 hours around the clock, and Sam and I split the overnight shifts between us so I could still function at the hospital because we had bills like everyone else and I couldn't afford to stop working. Not that anyone in my family ever offered to help with that either. Some nights I'd get home from a 12-hour shift, sleep 3 hours, and drive straight back to my father's house to relieve Sam so he could teach his first period class on. Neither of us ever said out loud how close we were to running on empty, because saying it out loud felt like admitting we might not make it to the end, and we both needed to believe we would. My father's hospice nurse, a colleague of mine named Priya, who I want to mention because she treated my father and me with more plain decency in 3 months than my mother managed in 11, told me in early January that we were likely looking at weeks, not months. I told my mother and Dean that same week in a group text I still have saved. My mother replied, with a single sentence, "I'll try to come by more." She came by twice more before he died, for a combined total of under 2 hours. Dean did not reply to that text at all. He sent a fruit basket, instead, addressed to my father, 3 days later. My father never opened it. I ate an apple from it, standing at his kitchen counter at 2 in the morning because I hadn't eaten since noon, and I remember thinking that was probably the most use anyone in my family had gotten out of it. Item 180-something in the notebook. I've stopped pretending I remember the exact number for that stretch because by then I wasn't counting for proof anymore. I was just trying to keep my hands busy while my father slept. Is the night in late January when my father, lucid for maybe the last real stretch he'd have, asked me to bring him his old fireproof lockbox from the closet. He didn't explain what he wanted with it. I brought it to him and left the room the way you leave a patient alone with their mail. I didn't think about it again until the lawyer's office 2 weeks after the funeral. My father died on a Tuesday morning in February at 6047, with me holding one hand and Sam holding the other. Quote, Dean was not there. My mother was not there. I called them both. Yeah, my mother arrived 40 minutes later in a coat that still had the dry cleaning tag on the sleeve. Dean arrived from Millbrook 3 hours after that, saying traffic had been bad, which I have no way to verify, and no particular reason to believe. Now I want you to sit with me for a second in the days between his death and the funeral, because that's where the promise comes in, and it's the whole reason I stood silent through what happened next. 9 days after he died, going through his desk to find insurance paperwork, I found a folded note in his handwriting, tucked inside a hymnal, that said only, Marin, don't defend yourself at the service, no matter what gets said. Let them talk, you'll understand why, after. Quote, I love you, kid. Dad? I sat on his kitchen floor and read that note maybe 6 times. Never found out exactly when he wrote it, but I know it was recent because the ink hadn't faded, and the paper hadn't yellowed the way things in that drawer usually did. I decided, sitting on that floor, that I would keep the promise, because it was the last direct thing he'd ever ask of me, and because some part of me, the part trained to trust that a chart usually explains itself if you're patient enough to keep reading it, believed he had a reason. So I stood in that fellowship hall 11 days ago, in the same church where my mother has directed the choir for 22 years, holding a paper plate I never once touched, and I let her tell 60 of our relatives that I had abandoned my father in his final year, while Dean, standing beside her in a black suit that still had the store crease down the sleeve, accepted condolences for being, in my mother's words, the son who sacrificed everything. She said it the way she says most things in public, warm and steady, the choir director voice she uses when she wants a room to believe her without asking why. An aunt I hadn't seen in years reached out and squeezed my hand and said quietly that she was sorry I hadn't found a way to be there more. Boy, I counted 17 seconds of silence in that room after my mother's original comment, waiting to see if anyone would correct her. Nobody did. Sam's hand found mine under the edge of the table where the coffee urn sat, and he squeezed it once, hard, which was as close as either of us came to saying anything out loud. I said nothing. I had promised. 2 days after the funeral, the whole family gathered at my father's lawyer's office on 4th Street to hear the will read, which is a completely ordinary thing to expect, and which is not. See what happened. The lawyer, a calm older man named Mr. Ostrander who had handled my father's affairs for almost 20 years, waited until everyone was seated, my mother, Dean, Aunt Ruth, Sam, and me, and then told us that before he read anything, my father had left instructions that a video be played first, recorded on his laptop 6 weeks before he died, the same laptop that had been sitting in that fireproof lockbox. My mother's face changed the second Mr. Usander said, "The word video," she asked, twice, in a voice pitched higher than I'd ever heard her use in public, whether it was really necessary, whether we could just get to the will itself. Mr. Kurth, Ostrander told her, gently but without moving, that those were his instructions, and that he intended to follow them. He pressed play on a laptop set up on the conference table, and my father's face filled the screen. Thinner than I remembered wanting to remember him, sitting up in that recliner with Sam's lap. Desk visible in the corner of the frame, speaking slowly but clearly. He started by naming the date. Then he said, "If you're watching this, I'm gone, and Carol has probably already said something at the funeral about Marin not being there for me." My mother made a sound I can only describe as a held breath finally let go wrong. My father went on, said he wanted the record straight in his own voice, because he knew nobody would believe a piece of paper the way they believe him saying it, and then, in the flattest, plainest tone he owned, the same tone he used to explain how a carburetor worked, he read from a printed page in his lap, 214 visits. That was his count, not mine. He must have asked me for the notebook at some point without me noticing, or counted along from what I told him some lates. 214 visits from his daughter, he said, against 6 visits total, combined, from his wife and his son over the same 11 months. He read out the $58 camera and what it was for. He mentioned the lap desk and named Sam by name and said, "That's a son-in-law. I want that on the record too." My mother tried to reach for the laptop at that point, and Mr. Ostrander, without raising his voice, simply moved it 8 inches out of her reach and said, "Carol, please let him finish." Then my father said something I hadn't been braced for at all. He said, "Real children show up." That's what Carol likes to say. I heard her say it about the Hendricks boy and his grandmother's lawn. I want it said, on this recording, in my own words, that my daughter showed up 214 times, and I am not asking anyone to pay her back for it, because that's not what a father does. I'm just done letting the wrong child get the credit for it. The room was very quiet. I counted the seconds again, out of habit. 11 this time, before. My father's voice continued, and moved into something none of us, not even me, saw coming. Before that, though, my father said one more thing directly to my mother through the screen, in the same flat tone he used for everything else on that recording. He said, "Carol, you're going to want to say I'm exaggerating, or that Marin put me up to this somehow. I want it on the record that nobody put me up to anything." I read my own daughter's notebook twice before I wrote this down, on the 17th of December and again on the 3rd of January, because I wanted to be sure the numbers held up both times before I said them out loud. My mother's mouth opened, and then closed again. That was the first crack, small and early, before the bigger one that was still coming. He said there was a second recording he needed us to see, from that same little camera in his living room, from a night in December that he hadn't told me about because he didn't want to worry me while I was already running on no sleep. He said Priya, the hospice nurse, had helped him access the footage after he noticed something on his phone one afternoon and asked her quietly to walk him through how to check it. What played next was raw camera footage, time-stamped 11,052 p.m. on a night in mid-December, a night I remembered from the notebook, only as item 190-something, a night I hadn't been there because Sam had taken that overnight shift so I could sleep before a 12-hour rotation. The footage showed Dean, alone, letting himself into our father's dark house with the spare key. He didn't go to check on our father, who was awake in his recliner, and said his name once, quietly asking if he needed anything. Dean told him to go back to sleep. Then the camera showed Dean going straight to the same desk drawer where the fireproof lockbox usually sat, opening it and going through papers for almost 6 minutes by the timestamp before he found and pocketed something small enough to fit in his jacket. My father's voice, from off-camera, asked what he was doing. Dean's answer, audible and clear on the recording, was, "Just checking on some stuff before Mom gets ideas about splitting things wrong." Then he told our father, who was crying quietly by that point to stop being dramatic. It's not like you're using it. What he took, we would learn a few minutes later from Mr. Hundred. Ostrander was the spare key to the safe deposit box that held our father's savings bonds. Bonds Dean had apparently hoped to have retitled before anyone else knew they existed. My mother stood halfway up out of her chair during that footage and said, That's not what it looks like, to no one in particular, before sitting back down. That was her crack. 17 seconds of it by my count before she straightened her blazer and said, in a voice that had already found its footing again, that grief makes people do strange things and that we shouldn't judge Dean too harshly for one bad moment during the hardest year of his life. Dean said nothing at all. He stared at the table. The recording ended with my father, tired but steady, saying one more thing directly to the camera. I loved all three of you the same. I just wasn't willing to let the two of you write history the way you wanted it written. Marin, you can put the notebook down now. I already read it. Why is us? Mr. are disconnected in your project and your frame. Ostrander closed the laptop, and for a moment nobody in that room said anything at all. I sat, with my hands flat on the table, the way I stand at a bedside when a family is absorbing bad news. Still, quiet, not filling the silence just because it's uncomfortable. I've learned that most people can't stand a silence longer than about 10 seconds without trying to fix it themselves, usually badly, and I had no interest in doing that work for either of them. Dean spoke first, and what he said was, you're taking that completely out of context. That was one time, I was going to put it back. Mr. Iowa. Ostrander, without looking up from the papers in front of him, said only that the safe deposit box records showed no return of the key, and that the bank had already been notified per my father's written instructions the week before he died. Dean's face went through 3 or 4 expressions in the span of about 5 seconds, landing finally on the same somber look he'd worn at the funeral, as if the room might still be convinced by it a second time. Then my mother recovered enough to ask, in a voice trying very hard to sound reasonable, what all of this meant practically, meaning I understood immediately what it meant for the will. Why is us? Mr. are disconnected in your project and your frame. Ostrander read the terms plainly. The house went to me, along with the balance of my father's modest retirement account, which came to $219,400 after the mortgage was paid off, not a fortune, but everything he had. Quote, Dean received the truck and a note read aloud by Mr. Ast. Ostrander in my father's own written words, that said the savings bonds Dean had already tried once to take without asking would instead be liquidated and donated to the hospice program that had cared for him, so that at least some good could come from that key. My mother received the household furniture, and a smaller sum meant, the letter said, to keep her comfortable, not to be misunderstood as a verdict on anything she said or will say. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't triumph. I read grievances at work the way I read a shift change report, factually, in order, without editorializing, because that's the only way to hand off a patient safely, and some instinct in me tried to do the same thing sitting in that office, tried to keep my face flat while my mother's whole version of the last 11 months came apart in front of relatives who weren't even there to see it. Dean finally spoke. He said the money didn't matter to him, that this was never about money, which would have been more convincing if he hadn't spent the next several minutes asking Mr. Bastang, Ostrander, twice, whether the bond donation was truly irreversible. My mother turned to me then, and for 1 second, one real second, the kind my father's own crack on that footage had been, her face did something honest. She looked, briefly, like she might actually be about to say she was sorry. Then she straightened again and said instead, You could have told me you were keeping records this whole time, as if the wrong in this story had been the notebook and not the 11 months that filled it. I told her, calmly, the only thing I had planned to say if I ever got the chance, that I wasn't going to give her an apology receipt for what she said at the funeral, and I wasn't taking the house or the money as some kind of payback, because that had never been what any of this was about. Told her the door stays open if she ever wants to have an honest conversation about the last 11 months, on my terms, at my pace, and not until she's ready to say the word sorry and mean the specific thing it's for. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, mostly, but that I also wasn't in a hurry. My mother tried one more time before we all stood up to leave. She said, You have to understand, I say things like that because I worry about you, Marin. I worry you take on too much, and don't let anyone help. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that in 11 months, she never once asked how she could help, not with a phone call, not with a meal, not with a single Sunday afternoon spent actually sitting with him while I slept. I told her that worrying out loud at a funeral, in front of 60 people, isn't the same thing as showing up, and that my father had apparently felt strongly enough about the difference to say so from a recliner 6 weeks before he died. She didn't have an answer for that. She gathered her purse instead and said she, quote, needed some air. Sam didn't say a word the entire meeting. He didn't need to. He just sat beside me with his hand flat on the table an inch from mine, the same steady presence he'd been for 11 months of 5 a.m. drives, and that was its own kind of answer to everyone in that room. Aunt Ruth was the only one who said something that stayed with me. She waited until the others had filed out, and then she put her hand on my arm and said quietly, I knew some of it. Ooh, I should have said something at Thanksgiving, at least. I'm sorry I let her keep saying it. I told her I appreciated that more than she knew, and that I wasn't ready to talk about the rest of it yet, but that I wasn't closing the door on her either. She nodded like she understood exactly what that meant, and she has since then called every Sunday, no strings, no asking for anything, just checking in the way a person does when they actually mean it. It's been about 8 months since that day at the lawyer's office. My mother has not called. Why, in terms and assist Milo for you. Sent one card at Easter unsigned except for her name, with no mention of the funeral or the video or anything that happened in between, and I understand now that this is probably the only kind of gesture she's capable of making without admitting what it's for. I haven't decided what, if anything, to do with that card. For now, it just sits in a drawer. Dean sent a single text about 2 months after the reading, which said, word for word, hope. You're doing okay, no hard feelings on my end. I did not respond to it, and I don't currently plan. Or, to. I heard through Aunt Ruth secondhand that he'd told a cousin the whole thing had been blown out of proportion by an old man who wasn't thinking clearly at the end, which tells me everything I need to know about whether he spent any real time with what that footage actually showed. Some doors don't need slamming to stay shut. They just stay shut. I've thought a lot, these past 8 months, about why my father chose to do it the way he did. The promise, the silence at the funeral, the video timed to land 2 days later in front of a lawyer, instead of at the service itself, where it might have felt like a spectacle. I think he understood something about my mother that I hadn't fully let myself see, that if he'd simply told her directly, in private while he was alive, she would have found a way to argue him out of it, the way she'd talked him out of things for 40 years. He needed a moment nobody in that room could talk their way around. A recording doesn't negotiate, neither does a timestamp. Sam and I still live in the house I grew up in, my father's house, because it turned out neither of us could imagine selling it. His lap desk sits by the recliner in the corner where it always did, and some nights I still catch myself glancing at the spot where that $58 camera used to hang, even though I took it down the week after the funeral. We have dinner most nights at 6030, tomato soup and grilled cheese cut on the diagonal at least once a month, because some habits you keep on purpose. I went back to work about 3 weeks after the funeral, sooner than my manager thought I should, but sitting at home with the quiet felt worse than a 12-hour shift did. The first night back, I had a patient's daughter camped out in a recliner by the bed, the way I used to camp out, by my father's, and I brought her a blanket and didn't say anything about why I understood so well what she was doing there. Some nights that job feels less like a career and more like the only language I have left for what happened to my family, and I've made a kind of peace with that. I still have the green notebook. I keep it in the drawer of my father's old desk, the same desk Dean went through that night in December, and every so often I take it out and read a page at random. Not to relitigate anything, just to remember what those months actually felt like from the inside before a lawyer's office and a laptop turned them into a story other people got to hear. It reads, mostly, like any nursing chart does. Flat. Factual. Nothing dramatic on the page at all. Think that's part of why it worked. That's my story. 214 visits, 6 from the 2 people who called it devotion, and 1 camera that ended up telling the truth neither of them wanted told. If you've ever kept the receipts on your own family without ever meaning to use them against anyone, just to protect yourself, I want you to know that keeping the record isn't bitterness. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between you and somebody else's version of your own. You don't owe anyone your silence forever, even if you owe someone your patience for a while. People ask me sometimes in comments on other stories like this one, whether it was worth it. The $58 camera, the 15-minute increments, the notebook I never expected anyone but me to read. I don't think I was ever doing it for a payoff. I think I was doing it the same way I'd chart any patient whose story mattered to me, because writing something down is its own kind of respect, whether or not anyone else ever sees the page. It turned out someone did. See it. That part was my father's doing, not mine. I just kept the record. He's the one who decided, quietly, on his own terms, that the record deserved to be heard. If this one hit close to home, share it with someone who's ever been the quiet one at a table, where somebody else got the credit, and tell me in the comments what the equivalent of your green notebook was. That's my story, and I'll see you in the next one.